you are applying sanctions to Russia. And in practical terms, it means you don't buy, supposedly, Russian energy at a much lower price, but you prefer to pay for the same Russian energy 3-4 times more.
Because you buy it indirectly via India and others. That's what you mean.
Of course. Yeah. Also Turkey. So we buy it from Russia at a discounted price because we are basically neutral as a NATO country, and we are making life easier for Russia.
Hello everybody, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Hasan Ünal, a full professor at the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Bashkent University in Ankara. We recently met on a panel about the new multipolar world, and I thought this is the perfect opportunity to finally discuss the geopolitics of Turkey on this channel. Dr. Ünal, welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you for saying yes, because I haven't had the opportunity to discuss Turkey in detail or in any kind of depth. And maybe let me start with this question. The renaming of the country, is it still acceptable to call it Turkey, or is that by now considered rude?
Well, I wouldn't think it would be considered rude, because I always use the word Turkey because, I grew up with Turkey, and, I can't change my English denoting of the country. Basically, the other problem with, Turkey is okay, but when it comes to the adjective of the country, then you have to say again Turkish. So you can't say Turkiye-ish. So
yeah, that's true.
Unless you want to change everything upside down. So presumably in our talk, I would be saying Turkey all the time because
thank you. That
I'm
makes
an
it easier
old-fashioned person. Yes.
Yeah, that makes it easier for me too, because I just remember it as Turkey all the time. But let's go into the geopolitical situation. I mean, Turkey has been in the news media, and it is around a flashpoint, which is these current negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, and it has picking up on this tradition. It did that already in 2022. And if you look at a map, you realize that Turkey again is kind of in the eye of the storm, but without being dragged into it directly. What is currently what's on your mind when you analyze Turkey's situation globally?
Well, globally speaking, on Turkish foreign policy, I would say that policy Turkey adopted at the onset of the war in Ukraine seems to be much more in line with Turkey's overall national interest. So, namely, although a NATO member, indeed a strong and reliable member of NATO, but at the same time with considerable ties to Moscow, both economically and trade-wise, but more than that, in terms of political consultation about important incidents and events across the region in particular. Again, Turkey and Russia over the years have established some sort of a cooperation mechanism. It doesn't mean that they see eye to eye over anything and everything, but they know how to get around the difficulties. For instance, when Azerbaijan, which is something like an extension of Turkey, we call it, as the great Azerbaijani leader Haydar Aliyev once said, that Azerbaijan and Turkey are the same nation, but two different states. So basically, when Azerbaijan undertook a major operation with considerable support from Turkey to recover its occupied territories, Turkey and Moscow, Turkey and Russia, that axis, if you like, between Ankara and Moscow, did quite a good job, actually, without harming Turkey-Russia relations. The Russians and the Turkish side basically acted in great prudence, if you like. And while Azerbaijan recovered its occupied territories, the Turkish, and although Armenia was somewhat an ally of Moscow, yeah, the situation could be handled, if you like. So you have all this cooperation and consultation mechanism between Turkey and Russia, but it doesn't mean, for instance, anything and everything can be handled as smoothly. For instance, Turkey and Russia seemingly have a lot of maybe differences over Syria.
And you are talking, of course, about the Armenian Azerbaijani war over Nagorno-Karabakh, right?
Yes.
Um, yeah, and the thing there, the interesting thing there was that the Armenian president Pashinyan actually kind of gave up his claims over Nagorno-Karabakh. So in a sense, the handling here was Turkey clearly supported Azerbaijan in this affair, right?
Turkey did, but Russia did not support Armenia to the same extent. So in the end, the Azerbaijani side overwhelmed the Armenian resistance, if you like. And in the end, but what is important here is not the Azerbaijani-Armenian issue, but how Ankara and Moscow basically handled the problem and the war and the relations now after the war, basically, have been again, and before the war and during the war and after the war, have been quite smooth between Ankara and Moscow. So what I'm saying is, okay, a member of NATO, but at the same time with good ties to Moscow. And then you have again Turkey with good ties to Kiev and Ukraine. So, on the whereas you have all the NATO countries, or a good number of them, with few exceptions, perhaps Hungary, they came up with considerable package of sanctions on Russia, but Turkey did not join in any of them, and cultivated its relations with Moscow before the war, during the war, and at the same time, it kept up all lines of communications with Ukraine too. So it is what I call a juggling. You are a NATO member, but you are a juggler. Okay, you play with a number of balls at the same time.
Yeah, and this is, to me, it's quite skillful because, I mean, this channel is called Neutrality Studies, and I call it like that because that's what I study as well. And I perceive on an analytical level, Turkey way more neutral than, let's say, Switzerland or Austria, which didn't send weapons to Ukraine, but they did put their full weight on the political realm and through sanctions threw it into the lot of the West, whereas Turkey didn't send weapons, or did it send weapons to Ukraine? I mean, it didn't put sanctions.
I don't think so.
No,
I don't think so. It had been selling weapons, particularly drones. The Ukrainians were interested in sophisticated drones Turkey had been producing. But this was mostly prior to the war. There may have been few things which was part of the NATO policy, perhaps, but I wouldn't think it was anything considerable, nor do I think that it was actually ever came up in any discussion between Turkey and Moscow. So, I mean, if you look at the other side of the story, for instance, with the second largest armed forces within NATO and with a flourishing defense industry of its own, Turkey would have made life very difficult for Russia over the Black Sea if it had been acting, say, like Britain, for instance, in the war. Okay? But it didn't. It refrained from all that because I think, first of all, our national interest doesn't actually dictate a policy of that sort. And secondly, even during the Cold War time, from 1965 to almost 2 decades into 1980s, for about definitely 15 up to 20 years or so, Turkey cultivated best possible ties to Moscow in economic and trade terms. And the Soviets actually built much of the Turkish heavy industry during that period, although it was a NATO member. So basically, you learn from your experience. At the time, it was purely limited to economy and trade. But this time, there is more, something like, for instance, a political consultation over regional affairs. And slightly more, but not yet in full bloom, that is defense cooperation. So Turkey bought, for instance, S-400 air defense systems from Russia. And at some stage, I have my hunches tell me Turkey will turn over to Russia, not to procure weapons, but to, and also perhaps to China, but to co-produce certain weapons, together in this part of the world, and with the aim of selling it to third parties in a joint venture, something. But that is not, I would think, right in store. That is not going to happen tomorrow. But yeah, I could foresee that happening at some stage in not too distant a future. You and I are going to see all of that. Okay, I'm much older than you, but I'm certain that I'm going to see that happening. So what I'm saying, on the one hand, you remain in NATO, but you diversify your foreign policy. I call it multidimensional foreign policy. And we had perhaps a small degree of that during the Cold War, but now it is going to be much more multidimensional in a multipolar world order, and that's quite understandable.
Understandable, yes, because it seems rational. But the point is that to me, a lot of European NATO members don't act very rationally anymore. Just think about the way that Germany just is okay with ignoring Nord Stream. It just ignores like who blew up Nord Stream. I mean, it's by now it's clear this was an inside job by either yourself or your friends. Well, you just ignore that. That to me seems irrational. What Turkey is doing is like balancing everybody off against each other. That makes very much realist sense. But why is it that Turkey is able to do that within NATO, whereas Germany and others seem completely, utterly, totally captured? Think also of the Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, the Finns, that all allow now, especially Finland and Sweden, 17 bases, 15 and 17 each, on their soil, and to like very to terms that look more like a colonial, a contract signed by a defeated nation rather than an alliance partner. Turkey doesn't do that. Why? How did Turkey escape that grip?
I think one point that is important for Turkey and its foreign policy, that is, from the Turkish point of view, Cold War years are over. In the sense that Turkey doesn't perceive threat from Russia. Russia and the Soviet Union was a threat at the end of the Second World War. But at the end of the Second World War, Turkey was a nation of 18 million. The Soviets had just lost 27 million people, but despite that, they were about 100 and nearly 70 million with enormous arsenal at their disposal. And then you had somebody like Stalin who wanted to change the whole status quo with regard to Turkey. So there was a Soviet danger, a threat, which pushed Turkey into the Western camp, seeking an alliance to be led by the United States and all that. But things have changed. Now you are talking about a nation of 86 plus million and growing by roughly a million per year, despite, although lately because of the economic crisis and whatever, the increase in birth rate has been, it has slowed down, but it is still there, and presumably it's going to continue, according to the demographic experts. And Turkey will become something like 110 million. And by the time Turkey will have become 110 million, Russian population will have come down to 110, 120 million. And secondly, of course, this doesn't explain all, but in terms of economic power and the military strength, Turkey, I mean, given how not difficult, but certainly not easy for Russia, its Ukraine campaign. So I wouldn't think any Russian government would ever, how shall I say, think of any such enterprise against Turkey. Okay?
Yes. Hmm.
Nor would any Turkish government ever think of any conquest at the expense of Russia. So you have a balance between the two countries. Of course, Russia is a superpower, particularly in military terms. It's one of the leading nations, and in terms of its resources, particularly, it's one of the richest in the world. Yes, but having said that, but Turkey somehow thinks that it can easily cooperate with Russia on all issues, and including not only economy and trade, but also politics and even military issues. So this gives perhaps Turkey confidence. Okay, but you can always ask the question: is Germany not confident enough? I mean, and if it is not, why not? The other thing, the Turks and the Russians get along very well. So the number of mixed marriages between Turks and the Russians are enormous. I mean, we've been with the Westerners, if you like, since Turkey's admission to NATO, but there has been just few mixed marriages here, and then many of them broken in some years. Not most of them working marriages, if you like. Some are, some more aren't. But with Russians, there is enormous. How shall I say? Basically, the two nations seem to get, in terms of population-wise, they seem to get along. So this is another thing. In terms of why Germany, France, or Britain are so anti-Russian, presumably there's one thing that is ideological. The ideological baggage is that during the Cold War years, the West basically consolidated its alliance, if you like, on the basis of an ideological Cold War against the Soviet Union. So basically, you call yourself the free world, and then the other side is the undemocratic, autocratic, and dictatorial, and blah blah, most of which were not apparently true. But there was a considerable degree of truth in what they were saying. Now, in the unipolar world order, all these assertions became somewhat an ideological pursuit. Like, goodies and baddies, good guys and bad guys, democracies versus autocracies. And human rights and freedoms as opposed to less human rights, no human rights, no political rights, blah blah. And all this, I think, affected the liberal Western mind and blended them into such thing that you don't basically concentrate so much on your national interest when you are formulating a foreign policy. So, and this is also a dictate by the American liberal elite, basically, to the European liberal elite. But this is something unsustainable. And I don't think the Western governments, particularly in Germany, France, even Britain, will continue with these policies. I don't think the present government, which has just come to power, is going to last more than, say, 2 years. And I think it will be taken over by the patriotic government, although they call them, right-wing governments. They're not right-wing, they're patriotic governments.
You're talking about the AFD, and
AFP, the Le Pen movement in France, Rassemblement National, and then you have the something equivalent in Austria. Yes, occasionally their assertions may border on racism and whatnot, but overall they are against immigration, and they are also against the dictation of the European Union and the United States to a large extent. So that means until and unless these parties basically come to power in these major European countries, they are going to suffer from that. No one can explain, for instance, that Germany's policy. You are applying sanctions to Russia, and in practical terms, it means you don't buy, supposedly, Russian energy at a much lower price, but you prefer to pay for the same Russian energy 3-4 times more.
Because you buy it indirectly via India and others. That's what you mean.
Of course. Yeah. Also Turkey. So we buy it from Russia at a discounted price because we are basically neutral as a NATO country, and we are making life easier for Russia. We have not closed off our airspace. For instance, much of the Russian traveling goes through Turkey, and much of the Western traveling to Russia, not also Western traveling, but I see, for instance, I get in together with Russian, Japanese scholars and others, traveling to Valdai International Forum through Istanbul. So basically, you get the Russian, say, oil at a very discounted price, and then you turn it into gasoline, diesel, and other items, and then you sell them at international markets at international prices to the Europeans and all the others. And they know it's Russian energy, it's Russian oil and all that. So why not buy, gas and everything, the cheap Russian energy, which is the lifeline for your industry? And then you actually are faced with deindustrialization of your country, which is the backbone of your economy. It is totally beyond anyone. But I think it is mostly to do with their ideological approach.
Is it fair to say that watching this drama unfold from Turkey, from Ankara, like you and a lot of other of your colleagues and of political and political analyst circles, you watch this in disbelief that these people are doing something really dumb and hurtful to themselves? Is this what's generally accepted in the discourse in Turkey?
Well, I'm one of those who kept heralding the arrival of the multipolar world order, but not all the academic elite and the foreign policy community, if you like, is like me. There is a great deal of, again, liberal-minded elite who think that Turkey should have sided with the West and should have basically excluded Russia from its foreign policy agenda altogether. But when you talk to them, when you have a debate with them, they have no argument to put forward.
Can you give me a rough estimate? Like how many percentage of people in Turkey would you think would sign up to your interpretation, and how many will rather sign up to the let's call it the liberalist interpretation of what should happen?
The trouble is not with the people. Presumably, a great number of, a great percentage of the population would basically agree with what I'm saying and with what the government does on this side of government's foreign policy. But it's the government's foreign policy in the Middle East is equally ideological. So our government's approach is requires a lot of scrutiny, if you like, in order to understand it. For instance, in the case of Turkey's policy towards the war in Ukraine, it is perfect, with few ups and downs here, but even the joggers sometimes get, tired.
Drops
and
the ball, yeah.
they drop one ball or the other, and someone would basically activate the ball again. You would be able to play with all of them. But when it comes to Turkey's policy in the Middle East, it is equally problematic, or it was. It is less problematic, but still problematic. But I'm talking about the Turkish elite. And the Turkish elite was certainly NATO-minded, liberal-minded, and all that. So they are basically losing out altogether. So when you talk to former ambassadors and people who used to comment on Turkish foreign policy, many of the academics, they are basically mesmerized by what is happening, not by the attitude Turkey has taken, but also much more by what Trump has been doing. For instance, he's destroying the collective West, and he's basically more concentrating on American foreign policy interests. And he's basically acting like America first, anywhere, everywhere. So there was this liberal party, which the liberals, both in Europe, Turkey, and the United States, thought would never end. But the morning has come. They haven't woken up because they had drunk too much. They need to basically digest all that. But when it comes to foreign policy discussions, my side of the argument seems to be gaining ground because we are basically talking about realities on the ground.
Yeah, and Turkey is surrounded by a lot of realities on the ground. I mean, you just mentioned. Sorry, just before that, is it fair to say that, in a sense, while much of Western Europe has been captured by some liberalist ideology and kind of ideology eats brain, like that hasn't happened to the Turkish political leadership? Maybe to some elites, yes, but not to the current leadership that defines policy.
Well, the trouble is the main opposition. The main opposition is very much liberal oriented. So if although the people, for instance, according to the polls, would like to prefer some sort of Atatürk way of policy, that is, Turkey first kind of policy. Okay, you put Turkey's interests first, and you should be modernist. You should try and make great efforts to modernize the country in every respect, but you don't get carried away by the Western councils. So you look at your interests first. But the main opposition party is not like that. And for instance, and that is why maybe they keep losing the elections over the last few elections. Otherwise, they could have swept through the board and they would have come to power. This is the dilemma in Turkey we are faced up to, actually.
But the opposition in Turkey has a problem, doesn't it? Because the opposition, let's say, the opposition in Georgia could bet on getting support from the European Union, right, for the European way and like Europe over everything. The problem Turkey has is that this liberal position, even if they wanted to join they want to join the European Union. I mean, the European Union doesn't want them, right? I mean, Turkey is kind of between a rock and a hard place when it comes to its economical integration. It has been now waiting for EU membership for what, 40 or almost 50 years by now?
Well, we signed the association agreement with the then European Economic Community in 1963.
Okay, sorry. 60 years now, sorry.
60 plus years, yes. And so the trouble, as you said, for instance, with Turkey, for instance, the Western European liberal political elite would easily bring Ukraine and or Georgia into their ranks, into the fold, but not Turkey. Even if there is a liberal government in Ankara, even if the liberal government would do their bidding, they don't want it. And that is quite understandable because it is too big a country with 85, 86 million population. So it would be the largest country in the European Union. It would have the largest vote on, on a number of counts. And then it would have the largest representation, say, Turkey's population has gone over 100 million, then it would have the largest basically group within the European Parliament. It would also consume the largest part of the funds and all that. So just the sheer size of the population makes it impossible. And then the European Union, for quite understandable reasons, thinks Turkey as a filter, okay, between the good part of the world and the bad part of the world. Turkey is not good, nor is it bad. It has combined both, but the baddies should not be right at the border of the European Union, but there should be a filter that should go through, and that is perfectly Turkey, okay? And from their point of view, that's quite understandable. And the strategic location of Turkey is mind-boggling for European Union leadership. How could you handle, say, a Syria war, an Iraq war, something with Iran, something with somebody else in Eastern Mediterranean? Anything could happen in that part of the world. And then if Turkey was a full member, then you would have to be basically you would have to do something or say something or act alongside with Turkey. So they don't see much enterprise for themselves in that part of location. From Washington's point of view, Turkey's location is incredibly important. But from Brussels, they are the second fiddle to Washington in terms of geopolitical thinking and geopolitical play, if you like. So they don't see Turkey as an asset, but they don't want to lose it. They don't want to lose it either, because Turkey is a good market for European goods, just as Europe is a good market for Turkey's produce goods, industrial goods, and what have you. So you have this sort of relationship, which you put quite rightly, quite problematic. Even if there is a liberal-minded government, as there was in the past, even the incumbent government was quite liberal-minded as it came to power. It was prepared to basically do any bidding of the European Union. It was prepared to give up its interests in Cyprus, its interests in the Aegean Sea. It was prepared to accept any dictate by the European Union, but then the European Union would have to tell the present government led by Erdogan, whatever you do, we are not going to let you in, sorry. We are basically putting up all these, how shall I say, impediments, thinking that you would not accept them. But if you were to accept them, we are not going to let you in any case, so act accordingly. So what I'm is that there is no way Turkey can actually make its way into the European Union, but you have these liberals who think that the only way out for Turkey is to push for membership of the European Union, and then to also remain a solid and loyal member of NATO. This is incredible.
But in a sense, what we're seeing now is that Turkey actually, I mean, on the political level, it isn't doing that, right? On the political level, it's playing its cards opportunistically, but I don't take this in a bad sense. It's like an opportunity arrives, you take the opportunity, right? You don't throw it overboard.
I would call it pragmatism.
Pragmatic, yeah, that's the better word.
Pragmatism, yeah, quite understand.
So to me, I mean, what Turkey is doing is actually makes a lot of very good sense. The question I have is how it manages this, because Turkey in this sense has a long tradition and has learned how to balance tension. While trying to have the best possible relationship with the EU, it tries to have the best possible relationship with Russia. It tries to have a relationship with its immediate neighborhood. It even manages a conflict with the European Union in Cyprus. I mean, Turkey. I mean, the EU and Turkey are on loggerheads when it comes to Cyprus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Very to the point where they shoot at each other, right? Or where shooting was involved back in the 70s. How is it? How is that possible while still maintaining a working relationship for all intents and matter?
Well, in the 1970s, the Greek Cyprus wasn't in the European Union, so there was no problem. But Turkey and Greece were members of NATO. So, but it was a problematic situation. But both Turkey and on the one hand, and Britain and the United States on the other, handled the quite difficult situation. So the island is divided, but as you said, because of the Greek Cypriot entry into the European Union, before a resolution has been arrived at to the division of the island, and from now on it is almost impossible because you have two working states basically on the island. So why should the Turkish side basically join up to the Greek side? And the European Union membership doesn't bring all the goodies as it was claimed at the time. So this is what, but as you put it quite rightly, Turkey manages this problematic relations with the European Union, and it has its differences with the United States, particularly as the United States seems to be, or intent on carving out a Kurdistan of the Middle East, and at the same time it manages its relations with Russia and even China. Now it's opening up to China, and China is opening up to Turkey too, in terms of whether it is going to lead to a great deal of Chinese investment in Turkey. We are going to wait and see, but there are signs that it might lead to that, and that would be a very good beginning between Turkey and China too. So what I mean is that if our government wasn't ideologically motivated, Islamist ideological motivated in the Middle East, it would have been even perfect. You can, for instance, have very good relations with Egypt, Israel, Syria. I don't know why the present government basically got involved in the Syria destructive war, because before the war, Turkey-Syria relations were, how shall I say, the two countries were on the best possible terms. For instance, almost as good as our relations with Azerbaijan today. So why did it get carried away by Western European, particularly American, how shall I say, advice and push into that is inexplicable, and I have been a vociferous critic of that. And again, our Syria policy has been, and I would say, to put it mildly, a failure. It doesn't, because it's not based on Turkey's national interests. But even with Syria problem, if you put it aside, these days, you have good relations with Egypt, and then with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Arab countries too. There's been a lot of going and coming between the two, not only at the political level, but there's financial, financial transaction between the two sides, and and I think Turkey is going to normalize its relations with Israel one way or the other, because we have always had good ties with Israel, although Turkey, for instance, in the past, again, from the mid-1960s onwards, though it was the first Muslim country that recognized Israel after the first Arab-Israeli war, it didn't vote for the establishment of Israel in 1947 at the UN. It voted against that. But after the first Arab-Israeli war of 1948, it recognized Israel. But despite that, from 1965 onwards, largely, it kept up its relations with the Arab countries. It supported their legitimate rights, Palestinians and others. It joined in the alliance, if you like, calling for the withdrawal of Israel from the occupied territories of Arab countries. But at the same time, it did all this without turning Israel into an enemy of Turkey. It was very good. And the Israelis did understand it. The Arabs did understand it. And it was, for instance, when the Oslo peace process got underway, and both the Israelis and the Arabs were saying to Turkey, "Oh, remain in the process because we need you, because we trust." And I think the Turkish foreign policy in the Middle East should go back to that. And I think it is going to, because that's the only way.
Two questions related to this. Aren't you worried now that the Syrian buffer between Israel and Turkey is basically eroded? I mean, Syria is dead for all intents and purposes as a working state in the borders that we know, and we now have the Turkish-backed forces, and presumably also like direct Turkish forces, almost at the doorsteps of Israel's expanded claims over Syria and what it establishes as a buffer zone. So we have these two now almost coming together. On the other hand, the genocide that is happening in Palestine against the Muslims, the Muslim population, but not just the Muslim population. We always forget that Palestinians also have like Christians and other denominations. Yes. But isn't that like bringing the mood to a boil in Turkey at the moment when it comes to Israel? How is that developing?
Well, this is the problematic point in in overall Turkish foreign policy. For instance, now Turkey is trying to bring the new Syrian government, which is supposedly under Turkish protection, and Israel together. And there are apparently negotiations underway in Azerbaijan.
Yeah, but Israel is still bombing the infrastructure of the new Syrian government.
Yeah, well, this is what Israel is. This is what Israel is all about. On the one hand, you have this, and on the other, you have Israel bombing these places, and the other. There was growing tension between Turkey and Israel over Syria, and also over Hamas-related policy. I think, again, this is where ideology comes in. For instance, Israel is quite used to being criticized internationally. But I mean, what they do, what they have been doing in Gaza, basically is beyond anything. So it is not, I mean, ordinary type of criticism wouldn't be enough to restrain Israel and what have you. It's all obvious. But in the end, who is going to restrain Israel? It is going to be the United States and its Western partners.
The only
No
ones
other
who
country.
could, yeah.
Yeah, the only ones who could. And perhaps also the Arabs who could actually put pressure on the United States administration, saying, well, look, we are involved in trillion dollars, multiple trillion dollars business transaction, this and the other. But then at the same time, we see Israel acting so out of order, and we cannot explain it to our publics. You've got to do something. So in an ideal world, Turkey should be supporting the Arab states politically and diplomatically, not to get involved in the inter-Arab disputes. You see what I mean? What happens between Israelis and the Palestinians is also an inter-Arab business,
Oh,
mostly.
you frame it as an inter-Arab business.
No. I mean, from an humanitarian point of view, Turkey should be expressing its anger, frustration, criticism, and what have you. But at the same time, it is also to do with the language you choose. For instance, if you call Israel a terrorist state, it is something every Israeli government, every Israeli political elite would basically take it as an insult. But if you say Hamas may be a terrorist organization from your point of view, but if you are dealing with the Palestinians in Gaza as a state, then you should be acting like a state with all the responsibility upon you. You can't basically act like a terrorist organization, as you call them. So, I mean, it is to do with the language, but our government has gone beyond anything on that. I mean, but you can also say, well, after all, what is being going on in Gaza is something no one could have actually predicted some years back, and it is also how shall I say, mind-boggling that in the face of an ongoing genocide, the United States sort of keeps talking about the 7th of October Hamas attack on Israel and the continual European support for Israel, despite few countries in the European Union and elsewhere saying something opposite or seemingly acting in a different direction. But what I'm saying in the end, I think I don't know what is going to happen to the people of Gaza, and they have all my sympathy personally. But the state policies are, how shall I say, sometimes formulated on not emotions, definitely. So, and the other thing is, even if we keep criticizing Israel in such a manner, that doesn't help the people in Gaza,
So
nor the people in West Bank.
Is that one of the reasons why Turkey doesn't put official sanctions on Israel? I mean, this kind of pragmatist politics of saying like, yeah, we hate what's happening, but if we escalate toward Israel, it wouldn't help them either. Is that your interpretation of how Turkey is acting in this situation?
I think Turkey has sanctioned Israel. It has stopped all its trade with Israel. But the trouble is, you see, for instance, Israel is buying, say, steel and what else? The concrete and all sorts of household goods and personal goods and what have you. And what happens is somebody else buys them from Turkey and then sells them to Israel.
Yeah, right.
So you can't basically sanction Israel in that sense. Plus, if the Arab world is largely trading with Israel, why should Turkey stop it? Because we are at the plus side in our trade with Israel.
sorry, one more question because it's just burning under my fingernails. But it's like, what's the role of religion or religious motivated politics in Turkey? Like, there is a serious movement in Israel that would love to blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque and build a third temple. If that happened, if the Al-Aqsa Mosque got destroyed, like the third holiest site in Islam, right? The what would Turkish reaction be to that?
Well, I can't comment on circumstances that are likely to happen. That may be a likelihood that it might happen. You know, if the Israelis and the Americans and others get that senseless to do that, and then it would depend on circumstances. I think it would also depend on what government is in power in Turkey. I would think. For instance, I can't think any European governments would be formulating their Israeli policies business as usual under circumstances as you described. And the other thing is, how would Egypt respond to that or react to that? How would Saudi Arabia? Could they simply say, well, you know, that doesn't really concern me? So it would be a total insult on the Muslim world. So all I would say that I hope that wouldn't happen. But if that were to happen, then it would be a different kettle of fish.
It would. Maybe the last, because this is quite a tour de force, but Iran. What's Turkey's relationship with Iran, and where do you see it going?
Well, the present government, again, is ideologically somewhat anti-Iran. Turkey, in terms of the policy pursued in Syria, was, how shall I say, at loggerhead with Iran. And since the downfall of the Assad regime in Syria, Turkey-Iran relations appear to be quite strained, although neither side would like to make any sort of concrete statement on that. The Iranians have their hands full in their negotiations with Trump administration. Plus, they don't, under the circumstances, because they lost Syria, and they may be losing. They may be at the losing end in Iraq. They wouldn't like to frustrate Turkey, or they wouldn't like to, how shall I say, turn Turkey against themselves any more than Turkey is already against them. And on the Turkish side, it is so complicated. For instance, Turkey, the present government, this is not something I would condone, but the present government is very much Hamas oriented. And in terms of its expression of vent and anger and frustration about what Israel does in Gaza, I would, of course, accept and condone it. But the way the present government in Turkey is handing glove with Hamas, for instance, I don't see anything in Turkey's interest in that. But Hamas and Hezbollah are coordinating their their efforts against Israel, but Turkey is against Hezbollah because Hezbollah Hezbollah acted in together with the Assad regime, and Turkey is against Iran because Turkey wanted to overthrow Assad, and Iran wanted to keep him wanted to keep the Assad regime in Syria. And so But Turkey-backed Hamas is quite friendly both with Iran and Hezbollah. So it's quite a complicated story. You will have to understand. And so when I look at all of this, I don't see much Turkish interest involved. For instance, when I analyze Turkey's policy towards the war in Ukraine, I would certainly say that it is in line with Turkey's national interest and quite understandable, very rational, as well as pragmatic, and this is how it should be. But when it comes to Turkey's foreign policy in the Middle East, for instance, until a few years ago, don't forget, Turkey turned the whole of the Middle East against itself because of its, ihvan-oriented foreign policy. Because it was involved in the war in Syria from 2011 onwards. Because of its foreign policy rationale in Syria, and it was against the Sisi regime of Egypt. I mean, the two countries were using, the policy was certainly inimical, between Cairo and Ankara. And then, can you imagine? You are against Syria. You are against the enemy of Syria, that is Israel. And then you are against Egypt. You are against Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. This was what Turkish foreign policy was about until late 2020, for a good decade or more. And because of the ideological commitment to the war in Syria, Turkey even brought down a Russian fighter jet. Can you imagine the degree to which the present government pushed things to the extremes? It was unbelievable. So from late 2020 onwards, somewhat a degree of sobriety, if you like, prevailed in Turkish foreign policy making, but still Turkish foreign policy making in the Middle East, but still there are certain problematic aspects, as I have just explained.
And
so
a lot of
it is mostly because of this ideological approach.
But some of this also has to do with Turkey's approach toward the Kurdish question, and especially in Syria, of wanting to prevent the establishment of a de facto Kurdish state. Is this also changing? Because recently, just last week, we heard very encouraging signs of like Turkish top leaders saying like, no, I mean, we're also a Kurdish state and an olive branch, as I haven't seen it for like 10 years, ever since Erdogan started cracking down on the Kurdish political party, like for no good reason, but for power political reasons internally. Are we seeing Turkey trying to mend fences, like with the Kurds and with its also Middle Eastern West Asian neighborhood?
Well, a sober-minded assessment of what is going on would just say that it's mind-boggling, because you are doing it with the PKK at a time when the PKK has been absolutely defeated inside Turkey. And at a time of multipolarity, Turkey has a lot of leverage with the United States and even Israel, and to destroy the PKK and how shall I say, PKK-led groups in Syria.
But they just disbanded last week, didn't they? They officially announced that they want to disband.
Not really, because PKK is just one branch of what they call their institutional framework. So PKK is the one inside Turkey. So they call the one in Syria by a different name. But it is the same thing. working for the same thing, aiming for the same thing. So what it is basically what the United States and Israel haven't been able to by now. Turkey seems to be doing it. So many of the political analysts here in Turkey think that it is all because of the upcoming elections. The upcoming elections, I mean, there is plenty of time, but the incumbent government thinks that it is not going to be able to win the elections anymore. It's been so long in power, plus the economic crisis, which has got aggravated by government's bad handling. And then it is, they are bound to lose the elections, despite the fact that the main opposition doesn't seem to appeal to all sections of the population, electorate. But in the end, there is a great likelihood that they are going to lose the elections. So what you do, then you talk to these PKK affiliated party, if you like, or the political offspring of the PKK, saying, can I just do some window washing, and you can claim it as huge victory, but you get your votes to me. Can you do that? But then the reaction from the electorate is, if you get one vote from them, then you lose maybe two votes on the other side. So basically, the government is, the government's situation is quite muddy. And the sort of, these uncharted waters are not the sort of things that Erdogan and his government are so used to navigate. They used to get easy election victories. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
But they caused an economic crisis out of which they cannot get. And then it is going to bring about the end of the present government, as every government's reign comes to an end. But they don't want to see that happening, and they can basically, how shall I say, they can do any deal with anybody sort of situation. This is the situation. And so it's not easy it may be quite muddy for the outsiders when they look at the situation. Even for us within the country and following what is going on, it is not easy to understand at first sight.
Not at all. And Hasan, I told you this interview would take 45 minutes or so, but we're already at an hour.
I've
thank you
enjoyed
very
it.
much for your patience. People who would like to read more of your analysis, where should they go? Do you have a place where you regularly publish in English?
I do, and I occasionally, I get, if they basically search Hasan Ünal, say, I used to write opinions for some of the Western newspapers. Sometimes, again, I write English analysis of the situation, but I also write Turkish analysis, and some of the internet sites translate them into English. It is called mostly Harici, actually. Harici, that is where I write. Harici, it's H
Arici.
That's right.
By our friend and colleague
.com. Yeah,
Tunç Akkoç, right?
exactly.
I'll
So
put Harici into the description box below so people can find you there.
Please do. And I have a program on the Harici site. It is called Strategic Compass, and I do interviews with experts from Turkey as well as from across the globe on geopolitical issues. So they can also see my English interviews with people, with experts And maybe we can do one with you at a later stage, you know.
Would be happy to. And everybody, go to Harici and check out Professor Hasan Ünal there. Hasan, thank you very
Exactly.
much for your time today.
Well, that's been my pleasure.